name is Joel. I work as an analyst with Outlier Ventures. We primarily invest in the convergence of IoT, AI, robotics with blockchains. So that's what we mostly do. Okay, let's get into this. How many of you guys have an Aadhaar card? All right, great. How many of you guys are worried about it being hacked? Great, already hacked. How many of you guys are annoyed with the constant spam that your banks send? All right. So that's what we're going to be touching upon today. We're going to be talking about how identity is all about personal rights and how blockchains help you protect them. Quick question. Anyone knows what this is? All right, yeah. So it's a 5,000-year-old inscription that basically explains that someone owes money to someone. And no one really knows what it exactly says, but there's mention of beer and rice. So 5,000-year-old transcription, one of our oldest proof of written records, mentions a transaction with an identity associated with it. So when Satoshi Nakamoto released his white paper in 2008 and people started talking about Bitcoins, they started talking about immutability, they started talking about tracking transactions, they started talking about cheaper transactions. But the one element most people don't really talk about is the fact that he slapped identity to almost every transaction on his ledger, and anyone could verify it at that point of time. So when you really look at transactions from an economic point of view, there's really two variables to it. One is the amount of money that you're transacting, and the other is the person that's transacting. Because one could almost argue that all money is not made the same way. It also depends on who is transacting on the other side. So identity has multiple contexts associated to it. So the first one is the socioeconomic aspect of it. Whenever you engage in a transaction, there's a counterparty risk involved. So if you go to Amazon or if you go to OpenBazaar, which is the decentralized version of it, you would see that everyone has a review associated to them before they make a sale, right? So at that point of time, what they're doing is they're tying their identity to that transaction so that you know that you can trust this guy. The next bit is the technological side of it. So 20 years on, since the beginning of the web's massive adoption, and we still use usernames and passwords. How many of you guys have been hacked at some point of time? All right, not many people. So the whole idea that you should use a username and password pretty much belongs to the 90s. And it's about time that we brought it back to the 21st century in some sense. The next bit is governance. So I don't know if you guys have read about this, but in Brazil and recently in an area in America, what the local leaders have begun doing is instead of actually just deciding that this is what my people need, they put out a poll that is actually registered on a blockchain, and they get real-time voter sentiments. So the next time that they go to the government to make a decision on their behalf, they know what their people want. So that kind of ensures that the people's voice is heard at the highest levels. Today, if you want a road repaired or if you want an amendment made, you have to rely on the member of parliament, right? But what if you could tie your identity to the decisions that the government makes? That's another solution that that blockchains provide. And the last bit is sovereignty, which we'll cover in a little bit. So what are the key problems with identity right now? All right, let's go to the Airtel banking conundrum that just recently happened. Basically, Airtel opened a bunch of bank accounts without permission, right? Why? They had the authority to do that. If you take Facebook, for instance, we rank one of the highest when it comes to censorship online. So from the last data that I checked, we had 5,000 takedown requests from the government. So basically, any centralized form of identity gives someone else the authority to define what is yours. So assume I steal your money, you can make your money back. Assume I steal your content, you'll still make your content back somehow. But assume I steal your identity and I do irreversible damage to it. Now that is how serious identity is as a problem, and we'll look at how blockchains help create certain solutions around it. If you look at the headlines that are here, be it Donald Trump being worried about having fake voters in his list, or Putin trolling the American elections, or Equifax hack, all of it has a strong relation to identity, and we rarely discuss about it. So going back to the evolution of identity, if you look at it, there's been 4 phases. The first of which is the centralized version. This is back when your kings or your government said that, okay, this guy, he's XYZ, and issued a passport for you. So you mostly relied on your government to issue it, and he would renew it whenever you wanted. The next bit was federated. So to dumb it down, How many of you guys have used Google Open Authentication System, basically where you say sign in with Google, right? So in that system, what happens is that Google comes in and says, okay, I know who this guy is. These are the details that you need. Just let him sign in. So that's how a federated system works. The next bit is user-centric. So in this model, what happens is, depending on the data points that a user shares, the system decides that this is XYZ. So to put it in context, let's say you want your credit rating. There are certain systems that basically take your social media posts and decide this guy is worth being given a loan for 1 lakh or 2 lakh or whatever. So depending on the content that you put out as a person, either on social media or through your work or through your banking transactions, people make an identity around you. So to put this one step forward, there are actually people who believe Facebook has shadow accounts on basis of people's conversations for accounts that are not even on the platform. So that's one form of making user-centric identity. The next bit is self-sovereign. So what this basically would mean is that just like how the internet was initially designed, it's meant to be such that a person owns his identity and he decides what is done with it. So if the government issues me a passport, the government almost has the right to revoke it at a later point of time. But in this system, what they argue is that the individual has the right to decide who does what with that data and basically ensure that his data is not revoked at any point of time. So I wouldn't get into the technical intricacies of it. We'll just look at a basic workflow of how the whole thing works. So let's take this event, for instance, all right? I'll use social proof as a context. When we were deciding speakers for this event, let's say a panel decided that XYZ person does ABC. All right, let's take that to be a claim. Once we have that as a claim, we would basically look for proof of the person having done this. So we would look at past events, we would look at past research papers or companies that the person has worked with, and we would actually verify that claim and use it as proof. And the next bit would be attestation. So imagine everyone that was on the panel discusses it amongst themselves and says, okay, this is one person that I can watch on, let's bring him in. Now that's a very dumbed down version of it. On a blockchain, there's a different model altogether, and I'll show you 2 cases. Okay, this is the most discussed use case. This is the most discussed identity-related startup of late. So Civic was started by Winnie Lingham, who's been famous for his price predictions, but he's also been a renowned entrepreneur. So Winnie had started this gifting platform, gift.com. I don't know how many of you guys have used it. How many have used it? All right. Okay, gyft.com. He sold it. But basically, for early adopters of Bitcoin, if you didn't want to convert your cash to INR and just buy Amazon gift cards, you go to gift.com, pay him in Bitcoin, and get the gift card. But he had a problem in the sense that he was accepting PayPal back then, and fraud was a very real problem. So AML KYC in e-commerce is still an issue. If you look at the news, you see cases of Flipkart having a lot of refund cases where they cannot really verify that this person's address is this. So what Civic basically does is they have certain authenticated partners within their network. So if you download the Civic app right now on your phone, which you can, and you should, in my opinion, what they'll do is they'll ask you to make a Civic ID, at which point you give your phone number and you give your email address. And they will verify that this is yours through a code and store that information on a ledger. All right, that's the first layer. Now the next bit is, let's say I want to do a banking transaction, or let's say I want to do AML KYC. At that point of time, hypothetically, what the white paper suggests is that I go to a banking partner of theirs, I provide documents, and the banking partner verifies what my identity is, and it stores my documents on either IPFS or associated related file storage mechanisms. So in this case, the files itself don't go on the blockchain, just the hash goes, like Nilesh had explained. So let's say I have to do a transaction with someone else tomorrow, and they want to get my AML KYC done. But at the same time, I don't want to share my personal documents with that person because I don't trust him. So what Civic basically does is it helps me send the person to Civic's system, and Civic basically says that, okay, this person's AML KYC is done, you can go ahead with doing your transaction. So and in this case, if you really look, a large number of ICOs have been happening on AML KYC with Civic, and there's been WikiHow off late. Okay, due to shortage of time, I'll be going to the key use cases in India. So how can we really use blockchains and identity in India? So I was just reading a paper on Aadhaar's evolution right before I came here. And in 1985, a woman basically burnt in 1985, a woman sold her sister-in-law for just 40 rupees just so that she could afford food. All right? That's how ration card, and the system came to evolution. In the late 90s, of every 100 rupees that the government spent, about 15 rupees reached the actual person that needed that help. So in India, the first layer that we could probably help solve would be through identifying who needs these subsidies and helping them have a system that verifies that the right people get these subsidies. The next bit is education, and I believe a Spring Roll would be doing a really good explanation of how verifying what a person has done through his education and work through a blockchain would be helpful. Taxation. I know many crypto-related traders who are willing to file their taxes, but just verifying where all they've done their transactions is hard. So assume Zeppay, Coinsec, and all these associated platforms had a unified identification platform that could actually relate to the government how much transactions have happened and could provide real-time taxation incentives. And the last bit would probably be fintech, in the sense that peer-to-peer lending would be an important use case for blockchain-related identity, in the sense that if all of my loans could be verified on a blockchain and my real-time credit score could be calculated with data on the blockchain, that would be pretty much accelerating how loans are dispersed in this country. All right, thanks. Any questions? Yeah. All right, freelancing. So I didn't go into freelancing because there are certain startups that do specifically that. So for instance, I work with about, let's say, 10 different startups during my college years as an intern. Now, when I want to give proof of whatever I did, I have to make a long portfolio of whatever I did. And even then, there needs to be a certain proof that the other party agrees that this work was done. So there are startups that basically let you track the transactions involved, in the sense that they track my files, they track the communication that I've had, and the reputation system on a blockchain. So let's say tomorrow, Sumuk or Nitin wants to engage with me for a project, they could literally just go there and see the history of everything that I've done. And since it's decentralized, there's no way someone could edit it to their preference. Yeah.
When you talked about Civic, you are essentially talking about a federated model, right?
Yes, good question. So there is no complete decentralization, in the sense that you cannot completely displace governments or individual organizations that verify this person's identity just yet. But hopefully over time, we will get there. So complete anarchy level of decentralization, we've not reached there just yet.
When we talk about self-sovereign in a blockchain world, we talk about an identity that I can create for myself, which is essentially a private key or something around that.
Yes.
And as long as I hold that, I should be able to do anything with the blockchain, right?
Yes, but the idea in context of identity is that people could attest certain documents that you hold.
Okay.
You could engage with certain distributed apps, or for instance, I could engage with you and you could get a key attribute, let's say my credit score or something like that, without going through all the documents. So it's a lot about data protection than decentralization in this context.
Got that.
Yeah? Okay, last question.
Hey, I had a question on like putting your financial transactions, right, on a blockchain.
Yeah.
I know it's encrypted,
Right.
but I might not want to put this information on a public ledger, right? So, so I mean, what additional security or protection can I have? Because
okay, so in this context, you would probably bring in permission ledgers. So permission ledgers somewhat work similar to how banking mechanisms work, in the sense that you could have a certain individual that can basically verify whatever transaction has happened. So not every ledger is a public blockchain, and not every chain has a public ledger behind whatever transactions. Yeah,
Okay.
Thanks.
yeah, I wanted to say this is a big topic for the government's hackathon, by the way.
Yeah,
So-
I'll try to be there.
Yeah, so
Thanks.
anyone interested should come.
Sure. Thanks a lot, guys. Anything? Yeah.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Joel. So same question. Poll of show of hands. How many are convinced that identity versus centralized government systems versus social platforms, blockchain-based identity tokens like Civic or Uport, etc., could actually be the future? Not as many actually. And why do you guys don't? Why do you guys not think it can work? How is Civic different than Facebook? At the end. Obviously, Joel should answer that. But isn't it true that with the Civic token, your private data will not leave your device? Oh, you were saying Facebook said that in the beginning, so Civic will become like Facebook. Oh, that's a different question. You're going into human psychology and all.